Hello, my name is Paula and I'm an EAP practitioner. I work at the ELTC at the University of Sheffield and I'm also a doctorate candidate. For my thesis, I'm looking at perception of flipped learning from teachers, students and management. I'm also looking at it from a motivational point of view. I want to know why the teachers embrace the method and why do students engage with the pre-session tasks. So the data that I'm going to be reporting on for this presentation, exploring the students' perceptions and experiences of an online pre-sessional using flipped learning, is part of the data generated for my doctorate thesis. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the context of my research, and then I'll briefly introduce the research methods that I use. This is a mixed methods case study. And the three key questions that I'm going to be looking at in this presentation is how do students perceive flipped learning? And this is part of my actual thesis as well. How do students perceive the live online sessions? This is not part of my actual thesis, this is kind of extra data generated. The fact that the course was happening online was a response to the COVID-19 crisis. And I didn't foresee it was going to have such a big impact on the discussion that I had with participants. So it's really, really lovely that these extra data has found a home in this presentation. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about my last question. Why do students engage with the pre-session task? And I'm going to talk about it from a self-determination theory approach. I have to say, in this course that I've used to carry out my research, students are required to complete the pre-session task. I'll talk a little bit about that more in a minute. I'll finish this presentation with some concluding thoughts and my reference list. So I've recruited participants from both the 10 weeks and the 6 weeks EAP pre-sessional course, and I collected the data in summer 2020. Most of the students are from China, but there are quite a few from the MENA region and even South America. Now you might be wondering why there is a little juggler in the slide. This is because I researched my home institution. I was looking at EAP, which is what I do. And I was also talking to international students, and I am an international student myself. So it is a bit of a tricky position. So the way that I've tried to ensure trustworthiness is by using reflexivity in the way Pain and Pain 2004 described it. So I've tried to be quite honest about my own bias and how I've challenged that. In practical terms, what that means for you watching this presentation is that there's going to be a bit of raw data that you're going to need to read. This is just so that you have the raw data and it's easy for you to assess whether my analysis is sensible or not. So, as I mentioned before, I look at these two pre-sessionals and they happen online. I want to say that the main focus of my research is flipped learning. So the University of Sheffield had adopted flipped learning 3 years ago. So for example, in 2019, the students had 15 hours a week of face-to-face teaching, and these included tutorials. And then they have the 10 hours of online-based facilitated content. So these are the pre-session tasks that students need to complete, and then they explore further more complex tasks in the session. Now in 2020, because of COVID, the face-to-face sessions happen online. So there are live online sessions and they were reduced to 10 hours, but the tutorials happen outside of those 10 hours. And then they still had the 10 hours online-based facilitated content. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between online learning and emergency remote teaching. And the idea of ERT is something that Hodges et al. Coined and explain how it's quite helpful to think about the online teaching that has happened or that it is still happening as a result of the COVID-19 crisis in terms of ERT. This is a way of managing expectations from everyone involved, but also to be fair to online learning as well. Online learning is heavily theorized, and there is a strong pedagogical principles underpinning online learning, but there's still a little bit of a perception that somehow online learning is a bit less successful than face-to-face, and experiences of emergency remote teaching may contribute to that negative perception of online learning. So I want to be quite careful on making that distinction between, you know, online learning that has been theorized and tested and pilot, and emergency remote teaching, which is basically we all had to move online and we just do what we can. So I think that's something to bear in mind. So I want to move on to my methods. As I mentioned before, this is a mixed methods study. So I distributed a questionnaire looking at a wide range of things related to flipped learning and motivation. 90 students respond to it. It was actually 91, but one of them didn't click on the consent form, so basically 90. This is a self-reported sample, self-selected sample. And in the same way, for my semi-structured interviews, I asked those participants if they were willing to be interviewed. And 8 of them actually went through the whole process and, you know, gave consent and whatnot. So I ended up with 8 semi-structured interviews. Just to tell you a little bit more about this, in terms of the statistics, I've just used descriptive statistics. And for my qualitative data, I've looked at the thematic analysis, like Braun and Clarke style. But that's all I'm going to say about the methodology. I'm sure at this point we're all quite familiar with flipped learning, but just a little bit of a review. Flipped learning is basically turning Bloom's taxonomy upside down. So low order thinking skills tasks happen before the session, and then higher order thinking skill tasks happen during the sessions. Basically, the students, with the support of the teacher and their peers, engage with more complex tasks within the session. This is a much more constructivist approach to teaching and learning, and I quite like thinking about flipped learning in this way because it can show how it is underpinned by strong theoretical principles. Alice and Thompson do talk about the 8 characteristics of flipped learning, but they do mention the important role of technology. And I'm not saying that technology is not great when we are working with flipped learning, and how it can be a great way of maybe presenting the pre-session tasks, but I feel that it's important to think about flipped learning as a way that of teaching and learning that is actually underpinned by a strong theoretical principle. You don't need technology to have a flipped class. I've experienced flipped learning as a student. I did English philology, and we had to read our novels in our poetry before we went to a session to be able to discuss them. And that is flipped learning. We did the understanding bit before the session, and then the evaluating and analysing bit in the session. So I think that's something that is an important distinction to consider as well when we're talking about flipped learning. I mentioned before that I was quite curious about, like, the main reason why I started looking into this was why would the students do the lower the thinking skill task before the session. So I looked at it from a motivational point of view, and of course researching motivation can be challenging, and I got a quote for that, but I feel like we kind of know this, but it's quite tricky. So I went for self-determination theory. Self-determination theory is actually 4 mini theories, and Deci and Ryan propose this way of exploring motivation. So for my project, I've used the cognitive evaluation theory and organismic integration theory. So from cognitive evaluation theory, Ryan and Deci highlight that 3 things need to happen for intrinsic motivation to be. So the first thing is autonomy. The students need to feel that they are autonomous and they want to engage with the tasks and the course. Competence, so this the tasks are achievable, basically. And then relatedness, which is not as important as the other two, but it still needs to be there. And it's this idea that you need to have a positive relationship with your environment. So the students need that positive relationship with their environment. It's basically if they're sitting there sulking about life, intrinsic motivation is not gonna happen. Now, it is widely accepted within educational circles that intrinsic motivation has a positive effect on teaching and learning, whereas extrinsic motivation can even have a negative effect on teaching and learning. I love this theory for a few reasons. First of all, this idea of autonomy, competence, and relatedness is supposed to be universal. So it works with multicultural groups like the one I'm researching. And also it conceptualizes the intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation as part of a continuum. So this is something that I'll talk about a little bit further on, but it is quite a nice conceptualization of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So I'm just going to move on to the meat of it. My first question, which is how do students perceive flipped learning? So overall, their perceptions are really, really positive. So students talk about how they would like to take another flipped learning course, like the one they have experienced. They've reported this course was quite communicative, which is very, very good. They do highlight as well that because of the use of flipped learning in this course, they felt more independent, so it contributes to helping them become independent learners. They do report as well that the course was a valuable experience in general. They can also see how these courses can contribute to their success in their future higher education studies. And in terms of negative perceptions, it's really quite minimum. They could also see the link between the interactive content, which is how we call the pre-session tasks, and the sessions. And this is really, really good. So within the literature, there's this idea that the pre-session tasks need to prepare the students for the session so that they can actually engage with the higher order thinking skills. So it's important that connection is there. And it's also important that the students see that connection and they overwhelmingly report that he was there and they could see it. They will also recommend it to their friends, which is lovely. So I'm just going to move on to qualitative data, which basically illustrates what we've been seeing on this table. And I'm just going to give you a minute to read this. I think what we can see from these quotes is, for example, Michael highlights this idea of how the course prepares him to be successful in the future university studies. Beatrice, this is just a quote, but throughout her whole semi-structured interview, she was saying how, because the course is quite busy and she had a lot of work to do, she felt encouraged and kind of like pushed to work a bit harder. So that was really quite nice to see. You can also see from both quotes that they appreciate the opportunity of being able to speak to their classmates within the sessions. Now, we're going to move on to the next quote. This one is from Omar, and he's actually from Colombia, and I'll let you read it again. Something quite interesting from this quote that you can say is that he uses quite a little bit of teacher talk. So he talks about andragogy, and so I was a little bit, because the students had amazing awareness of pedagogical principles underpinning flipped learning. And it's because the first task that they do in their presessional is reading about flip learning, and they have to do a little bit of a writing task around it. And this idea of explicitly explaining pedagogical principles underpinning flip learning as a contribution to success appears in the literature. We got the quote there. And I think these findings echo that perception that you kind of need to tell the students what you're doing and why. And that could account for the positive perceptions that I've been discussing so far. I think Omar's quote is particularly nice because he talks about he knows what's coming, so he feels ready and prepared to be successful. So again, there's this idea that he feels competent to achieve his goals. So I'm going to move on to my next research question in this presentation, which is how do students perceive the live online lessons? And quantitative data shows how everyone's happy. So that, you know, they could see how, they discuss with their classmates and that helps them learn. The teacher has time to answer the questions, and there's enough teacher time as well to communicate with them. And they feel like attending the sessions has really helped them improve their academic English. Now, when we look at the qualitative findings, things are not that clear. And I'll show you what I mean. Just let you read this couple of quotes. So this little disagreement is quite common in the interviews. So some of the students feel like it was fantastic to have the opportunity to talk to their classmates, and the teacher was the guide on the side and blah blah blah, whereas others really felt that they could have done with more teacher time, which is not something that is that division is not so clear in my quantitative data. So I was quite shocked to see that in the qualitative data. I think it's a lot richer in that way, that it just shows those different perceptions. I got a couple more quotes for you for this question. So I think Beatrice is talking about something that also appears in the literature quite frequently, more within second language acquisition, and all this idea of students having their first L1 being the same, and that being a bit of a problem in terms of using the target language. She did talk quite a bit about how she could have benefit from having the teacher in the breakout room, and she talked also about a potential benefit of having the teacher in the breakout room in terms of her feedback. So she felt quite confused about general feedback. So I thought that was quite interesting as well. I've picked up more quotes again because this idea of the internet connection was not great was highlighted with every participant. So when they talk about difficulties of online learning, it was basically the internet is not good enough, or my computer freezes. So it's not so much a problem with online learning or TEL, but rather a tech problem. And this was quite prominent in the interviews with the teachers as well. So I mentioned before that I use self-determination theory because it conceptualizes extrinsic motivation as part of a continuum. So here you got the continuum. So here, I hope you can see the arrow. With external regulation, this extrinsic motivation that's externally regulated is basically, I do things because otherwise I'm going to get punished, or to avoid sense of guilt. So it's not a behavior that is coming from the individual. Whereas identified and integrated regulation is closer to intrinsic motivation because the behavior kind of like comes from the individual. for my research, I've kind of taken the cue from Noel et al. 2000, and because they combine identified and integrated regulations, I've done the same thing, just because it is really quite difficult to pinpoint the difference. So that's something I've done. And I've also, very similar to their own research, I gave the students quite a few sentences that reflect all these points within the continuum. And these are my top 4. So 67% of the students are closer to external regulation. And they said that they desire to be successful in their university studies was the main reason why they engage with the pre-session content, the pre-lesson content. I think this is not really surprising. These students are taking a high-stake course, which is a pre-sessional. They need to pass the pre-sessional course to get into uni. It is instrumental, so I think no surprises there. Something a bit more hopeful is that the second most common option, with 62% of the respondents, is that they engage with the pre-session task because of the satisfaction of learning new things. So I think that's really, really good, and it shows that the way flipped learning was implemented in this particular course did have all these elements to foster intrinsic motivation, or at least extrinsic motivation that is integrated or identified regulation. So that's quite good. For the third one, we got back to this idea that it is expected of them. I think when the students learn about flipped learning and the pedagogical underpins and whatnot, I think that's where all this comes from, that, you know, they just have to do it if they want to be successful in the course, and they obviously want to be successful, as you can see from the first reason. And then they go back to this idea of integrated regulation, where they just want to be, you know, it's the active choice. They want to do the interactive task, the interactive content, which is how we call the pre-session task. So that's quite nice. I don't know if you noticed, but throughout my quantitative data, there is the one student who's systematically hating everything. For this question, that student actually tick the only reason why they engage with interactive content is this one, that they chose to be the person who complete the IC. So for me as a researcher, I would have loved to have the opportunity to have a semi-structured interview with that student, but unfortunately they didn't agree to it. So I'll never know why they hate it so much, but yet they display this integrated regulation. But it would have been nice to know. I'm going to show you a couple of quotes from the qualitative data that illustrate these little bounds between integrated regulation and standard regulation. I think these quotes show kind of like what the quantitative data is reporting. So it's this idea that, you know, they obviously want to get into uni, they got family pressure, they really want to get there, but there is also that sense of them wanting to actively engage with the course content and their pre-session task. I want to draw your attention to something that Marla says that I was not expecting. So she talks a little bit about the role of culture in engaging with flipped learning and the interactive content. This idea of the role of culture in engaging with flipped learning has appeared in the literature, and is very, very common in my semi-structured interviews from the students and from the teachers as well. So there seems to be this perception that certain groups of students, because of their cultural background, are happier to embrace flipped learning. I'm a bit conflicted about how to deal with this data, to be completely honest, because I think it can be a problematic overgeneralization. My sample is quite small, and there seems to be this like belief that the role of culture, particular culture, has a massive impact on embracing flipped learning. I'm not sure how I'm going to deal with it in my thesis, but it is there. So I thought I'll draw your attention to it, because it's there and it's quite prominent and it keeps appearing and so frequent. So I thought I'll highlight it. And on that note, just to give you my concluding thoughts, I think overall it's safe to say that flipped learning was positively perceived. The online lessons were positively perceived if we just look at the quantitative data, but I think that once we started digging a bit deeper and looking at the qualitative data, then things were not that positive. The takeaway message though, and I think this is quite important, is that most of the problems were not so much about online learning, but rather technological issues like, oh, my connection is too slow, or my computer freezes, or some of the students reported being quite anxious when they were sent into their breakout rooms because the connection was not so good. So they were a bit concerned about being kicked out of the class and whatnot. So that appeared quite frequently. And I think it's a very valid concern. And it's something that maybe kind of contributes to this idea of keeping that distinction in mind between online learning and emergency remote teaching, and how we're using technology and to present our courses and stuff. And I think that's maybe a result of emergency remote teaching rather than online learning, but that's something to keep in mind, I guess. Then we're looking at the reasons why students engage with the interactive content. So these are the pre-session tasks that they need to complete so that the sessions can actually go ahead and they are useful. So the most common reason why it seems to be towards the external regulation side of the continuum, looking at extrinsic motivation, but then the second one will be introjective regulations. As I said before, that's quite a positive finding, and I think it goes to show that the way flipped learning was enacted in this particular course was really quite positive for the students involved. So thank you so much for listening to this presentation. These are my references. I'm looking forward to answering your questions in the next session.